to this second session of the course, Asian and Asian American Feminist Theologies. My name is Kwok Hui Lan from Kendall School of Theology. Today's topic is Biblical Studies on Gender and Class. We'll have a webinar with 2 presentations, followed by a period of questions and answers. After the webinar, participants can join small group discussion in a Zoom meeting. I hope you will stay on and meet other participants. Please post your comments on the chat and your questions in Q&A. Our first speaker is Dr. Gale A Yee, Nancy W. King Professor of Biblical Studies Emerita at Episcopal Divinity School and President of Society of Biblical Literature in 2019. She is the author of Poor Banished Children of Eve, Women as Evil in the Hebrew Bible, Jewish Feast and the Gospel of John, and Composition and Tradition in the Book of Hosea, as well as many articles and essays. She is the editor of Judges and Method, the Fortress Commentary on the Old Testament and Apocrypha, and the Hebrew Bible, Feminist and Intersectional Perspectives. She has a new book coming out in the fall, Towards an Asian American Biblical Hermeneutics and Intersectional Anthology. Please welcome Dr. Yee.
I thank Panautum for this invitation to speak to you this evening. And I'm especially happy to join Dr. Maggie Low all the way from Singapore. And I understand, Maggie, that it's around 8 a.m. your time. And I'm very glad you're starting your day with us. And I also welcome those of you who are joining us not only in the US, but in other parts of the world. I mean, what a wonderful community of sisters we have here on this occasion. What I will be talking about for the next 30 minutes are my own approaches to the biblical text as an Asian American intersectional biblical scholar. I no longer call myself a feminist biblical scholar, although I certainly have not given up feminism. Rather, I am an intersectional biblical scholar, analyzing the sacred text not only through the lens of feminism, but also through the lenses of race, of class, of colonial status, colonization, and so forth. The isms of oppression, such as sexism, racism, classism, colonialism, ableism, all those isms are all intersected, interconnected, deeply entrenched and layered among themselves in what Patricia Hill Collins calls a matrix of domination. We cannot simply have single axis investigations just focusing just on gender or just on race or just on class, etc. any longer. These would just be outdated analyses. We cannot simply put gender into a silo and not related to class or to ethnicity or to colonial status or religion or whatever. Nor can we have an oppression Olympics saying that sexism is more oppressive than racism, or racism is more oppressive than ableism, or homophobia is more oppressive than class exploitation, etc. We have to be attentive to the power dynamics that interweave, intersect, and collude among the isms. Such analyses are daunting because just dealing with the sexism in the biblical text is exhausting in itself. But it is even more grueling to see how the other isms operate in conjunction with, alongside, behind, or in front of sexism itself. Sexism and all the other isms are relational. They do not exist in isolation from each other, but intersect with and overlay each other in tight webs of oppressions. What we must do is qualitatively investigate the relational dynamics that persist among all these oppressions. Intersectional analyses make the fundamental point that we who study and interpret the biblical text have many important facets to our identities that are affected differently by many interacting systems of oppression and also of privilege. As a method of biblical interpretation, intersectionality presumes that our own unique social locations, our own distinctive fusions of gender, race, class, and so forth, influence our readings of texts and our interpretations of them. Intersectionality encourages us to think beyond the familiar boundaries of biblical studies, to expose the diverse power relations of inequality in the text and uncover those subjugated voices that have been invisible or unheard. So what is my own social location that somehow influenced the way I became an intersectional biblical scholar? Let's talk about my journey so that you can reflect on your own journey in the study of the biblical text. My journey will be different from yours. The various ways we study the Bible always flows from our own individual and unique contexts. These contexts shape us into who we are and impact directly on how we approach the Bible. The different ways I study the Bible is directly influenced by my personal context, and they may not be your ways. I am a third-generation Chinese American. I am the oldest of 12 children and in a very strict patriarchal Chinese home, Chinese American home, I should say. My father and mother had definite sexist attitudes for their sons and daughters. For the first 10 years of my life, I grew up in the racially African American and Puerto Rican slums of Chicago. It was a violent place. The $20 that my mother gave me to buy groceries was stolen from me by two African American boys when I was only 10 years old. I mean, back in the 1950s, $20 was a lot of money. Now, we eventually moved into a white neighborhood. However, this neighborhood soon became racially Black because of the insidious efforts of real estate agents to frighten whites to move out. This practice in the States is known as redlining. So you can see that from a very early age, my female gender, my Chinese American race ethnicity, and lower class status are integral parts in the formation of my identity. Now, I was raised Roman Catholic, and I remained one for over 50 years until I became an Episcopalian. It has only been recently that I realized that my Roman Catholicism deeply influenced the way I interpret the Bible. Most of the Asian American biblical scholars, along with many of my white colleagues whom I know, were raised as Protestants along different points of the theological spectrum. Unlike them, I was never bound by Protestant doctrines of biblical authority, particularly in the public square on the use of the Bible in social and cultural issues. because of my Roman Catholicism. The hermeneutics of suspicion regarding the text came more easily for me and with less struggle than for some of my Protestant colleagues. I was able to name the sexism, racism, homophobia, and the other isms in the text and say it, this is not the word of God, while at the same time deeply honoring the Bible's theological wisdom and beauty. I was the first of my family to go to college. I did my master's degree in New Testament, and New Testament actually occupied 5 years of my doctorate. Now, because of it, I could not get excited about a New Testament dissertation, among other things. I thankfully switched over to the Old Testament, remaining in doctoral study for 4 more years. Now, I was not a feminist during my graduate school years. I was occupied in trying to pass my 6 language exams, French, German, Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and Ugaritic. I already had a passable reading knowledge of French and a little Greek when I started the PhD, but I had to learn the remaining 4 while doing my doctorate. In addition, I tried my best to master the historical criticism, source criticism, tradition criticism, form criticism, and redaction criticism of the biblical text that was demanded of me by my male professors. Needless to say that my biblical training was a white male and Eurocentric one. So feminist interpretation of the Bible was not on my radar when I was doing my doctoral studies. However, during the 1970s, when I was doing my doctorate, there was a paradigm shift in biblical studies from historical criticism to literary criticism. Studying the Bible from a literary perspective was something that appealed to me because I was an English major in college. Historical criticism of the Bible primarily focused on discovering the author's meaning. Literary criticism, however, moved beyond historical criticism and its fixation on the author by examining the meaning of the text in and of itself, its literary features, its style, its rhetoric, and more importantly, on the meaning that was created in the dynamic interaction between the text and its readers. And as you know, there are many readers of a text: male and female readers, liberal and conservative readers, Catholic and Protestant readers. I mean, I can go on. Once biblical studies moved beyond trying to discover the meaning of the ancient author to the meaning of the biblical text for a huge plurality of readers from different time periods in different geographical locations, social and cultural settings, etc., then you will observe different interpretations of the Bible from the perspectives of many readers who themselves are quite diverse in their own individual identities. Biblical studies has traditionally been centered in white male European conclaves, who for decades during the first half of the 20th century, primarily tried to discover the meaning and historical circumstances of the biblical author. This was the normative way of doing biblical studies that I was trained in. And I am indebted to this training. I do not regret it at all, and have taught different forms of historical criticism to my graduate students. Historical criticism is important in interpreting the Bible because the Bible is so historically, socially, culturally, geographically, linguistically removed from our own postmodern times. And we need to understand that the biblical author's theological understanding of religious life, his understanding of God, the behavior between men and women, of sexuality, of the relations between ethnic others. We need to know his understanding of these. We need to know the knowledge of the biblical authors because their theologies, especially their sexism, racism, etc., may not be relevant or fit neatly or at all in our own worlds. So my particular gender, ethnicity, class formation, religious upbringing, and my academic training in biblical studies have all been significantly influential in becoming an intersectional biblical scholar. So let's talk about intersectional interpretation of the biblical text. One of the best examples of intersectional thinking was done by Cheryl Anderson, an African-American Christian Old Testament scholar and a good friend. Cheryl declares that the transformational change for inclusive communities can only occur when groups working towards justice strategically incorporate the issues of another marginalized population. So instead of focusing on just one ism, justice-oriented groups should integrate the concerns of other oppressed groups. And I'm going to quote her at length here because what she urges is a great example of the matrix of domination and the politics of power and empowerment. Instead of supporting the dominant condemnation of homosexuality, heterosexual women need to understand that the same underlying rationale for this condemnation supports the subordination of women. Therefore, fighting heterosexism and homophobia should be an integral part of a feminist agenda. Instead of supporting the dominant condemnation of homosexuality, African American church leaders need to understand that the same underlying rationale for this condemnation supports white supremacy. That is, the dominance of white people over people of color. Therefore, their continuing struggle against racism should include the struggle of heterosexism and homophobia. Instead of supporting the dominant condemnation of homosexuality, African church leaders need to understand that the same underlying rationale for this condemnation supports the dominance of the West and its exploitation of Africa's resources. Therefore, any critique of global capitalism as neocolonialism should also address heterosexism and homophobia. Similarly, instead of condemning the homophobia of African and African American communities, leaders in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered communities need to understand that the same underlying rationale for the condemnation of homosexuality supports racism. Therefore, white LGBTQ leaders have every reason to struggle against racism as part of their own activism. Unquote. I am sure your head is swimming in thinking that every time you interpret the biblical text, you have to be completely conversant with all that is involved in racism, sexism, colonialism, class bias, homophobia, and all the other isms, and then incorporate them in your analyses. However, that would be arrogant, even to claim that you have dealt with all the isms in your interpretations? There is a simpler way to begin. Remember that the isms are all relational. They are not isolated from each other. In trying to understand how all forms of subordination are interconnected, Asian American lawyer Mari Matsuda uses a method she calls ask the other question. She says, when I see something that looks racist, I ask, where is the patriarchy in this? When I see something that looks sexist, I ask, where is the heterosexism in this? When I see something that looks homophobic, I ask, where are the class interests in this? Working in coalition forces us to look for both the obvious and non-obvious relationships of domination, helping us to realize that no form of subordination ever stands alone, unquote. Asking the other question in our biblical interpretations is a good start in helping us in thinking intersectionally. Let's take an intersection analysis that I did on the Book of Ruth as a perpetual foreigner and a model minority. I picked this example because some of you have already read this essay, but perhaps did not realize that it was an intersectional analysis. This was an essay in which I read the Book of Ruth, not only through the lens of my gender, my Chinese ethnicity, my lower class social formation, but also my personal experience of my mother's widowhood. My mother became a widow when my father died when I was 23 years old, and she became a single mother with 12 children. I therefore resonated with a story about three widows and how they individually dealt with the personal loss of their spouses. Many read the Book of Ruth as an enchanting, optimistic story of female empowerment and romantic heterosexual love, where she gets the guy in the end. However, other readers have asked the other question. In contrast to its heteronormativity, lesbians have observed the homoeroticism of the text. Asking the other question, Asian feminists have pushed back against the interpretation of this mutual and warm relations between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law in Ruth. They emphasize the often conflicted and hostile relations between Asian daughters-in-law with their mothers-in-law. In my own analysis, I asked the other question as an Asian American biblical scholar. Asian Americans have been regarded by US society as both model minorities and perpetual foreigners. On the one hand, the dominant white society stereotypes Asian Americans as the racial ethnic group that has fully assimilated and achieved the American dream, in contrast to African American and Latinx Americans. Asian Americans become the model minority with whom other ethnic groups in the US are compared. On the other hand, Asian Americans do not fit in the black-white binary of US society. Their racialization is not like African Americans, whose marker for otherness rests on the axis of color, being Black. For Asian Americans and Latinx and Arab Americans, the marker of otherness rests on the axis of citizenship, whether one resides in the US as a citizen or as a foreigner or alien. Now, I asked the other question whether or not the person of Ruth was similar to Asian Americans who are regarded as model minorities or perpetual foreigners. And I discovered that Ruth is described by the biblical author as a model foreigner who leaves her country Moab and binds herself to her mother-in-law Naomi to become a model convert to Naomi's God Yahweh and an exemplar to the Jewish people as a whole in her chesed, her covenantal love. But I also discovered that the writer depicts Ruth as a perpetual foreigner. She is continually called Ruth the Moabite, not Israelite, even after her immigration. She loses her Moabiteness when she gives birth to a son. But even here, she is displaced as her son's mother by Naomi, and she completely disappears from the story. I also asked the other question about the class relations among the main characters. A number of power relations come into play simultaneously in the interactions of the main characters with each other. So, for example, an economic gulf exists between Boaz and the owner, who's the owner of the land, the means of production, and Ruth as the foreign gleaner of the land's leftovers. Boaz does not work in the fields, as do his reapers and overseer. Rather, he commands them. He thus lives off the surplus labor of those who do the work. Now, Naomi doesn't work in the fields either. She too lives off the labor of Ruth the foreigner. She too urges Ruth in nonstop gleaning and is the one who instructs Ruth to seduce Boaz in the middle of the night. Naomi's class status is more aligned with Boaz than with Ruth, especially when kinship intersects with ownership of the means of production. Naomi's husband had a piece of land, and that little piece of land becomes the means by which Naomi can gain financial security, and Boaz can enlarge his property. Naomi and Boaz achieve these goals by strategically using Ruth's body. Naomi by prodding her to seduce Boaz, and Boaz by thwarting his rival by taking Ruth in marriage. Ruth becomes the economic means by which both Naomi and Boaz profit economically. I asked the other question whether or not there are many modern day analogs to the exploitative class relations that are evident in the book of Ruth. And sure enough, I found this in the sex trafficking of young Asian women and in the first world exploitation of developing countries and of illegal or undocumented aliens who come to the first world looking for jobs and for a better quality of life and who are exploited terribly. So for some of the takeaways that I leave you as you interpret the biblical text, first of all, be aware of the major social, cultural, religious, etc. factors that have been influential in forming you and your distinctive identity. Your race, ethnicity, your gender, your religion, nationality, class. These factors have had both positive and negative impacts on the way you interpret the Bible. Second, be conscious of the ways gender, race, class, etc. are depicted by the male author. It is your interaction with this author's text that creates meaning. And there are going to be different interpretations and meanings in that interaction. 3, the isms are all relational. Any intersectional analysis of gender, for example, should always take into consideration another marginalized group or groups. And finally, a simple way to begin an intersectional analysis of the biblical text is by asking the other question. If you see sexism in the text, for example, what are the hierarchical class formations? So that is all. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Dr. Gale Yee for this wonderful presentation. Dr. Yee shared with us her social location, her education in biblical studies, and also this intersectional approach to biblical interpretation, and giving us an example of the Book of Ruth. Our next speaker is Dr. Maggie Low, who is a lecturer in Old Testament studies at Trinity Theological College in Singapore. Her PhD is from Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. Formerly trained as a lawyer, she is an ordained minister of the Presbyterian Church in Singapore and has served as a pastor for 11 years. Her latest work is Reading Isaiah in Asia in the Oxford Handbook of Isaiah. She's also the editor of a groundbreaking volume, Asian Feminist Biblical Studies, which will come out soon. Dr. Low.
Good morning to everyone in Asia, and thank you, Pui Lan, for the introduction. And it's a privilege to be here to co-present with Dr. Gale Yee, whose work I have referred to in my own studies. And good evening to all those in the Western world, and good afternoon to all those in between. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Okay, I hope you all can see that. My topic is Asian Feminist Biblical Studies, and here's a map of the areas that I'm going to cover, and it's mainly about East Asia, and then South Asia, and where I'm from Southeast Asia. So let me start with a personal introduction to myself. Feminist biblical study is something that is very close to my heart because it has impacted my ministry and in the process of my ordination. Now in Singapore, not every denomination ordain women. The Methodists have been open about it. The Anglican diocese in Southeast Asia is one of the few dioceses in the world that does not ordain women. And I'm a Presbyterian, and the Presbyterians are somewhere in between. We're quite a mixed bag because ordination is left to the leadership of each congregation. So some churches ordain women and some don't. And I want to tell you a personal anecdote that when I was being interviewed for my ordination by a committee of ministers, one of them asked me this question. He asked me, how are you going to cope as a minister and as a mother? Now, at that time, the Presbyterian Church in Singapore, the English Presbytery, to which I belong, because in Singapore, we're kind of divided along language lines, English Presbytery, Chinese Presbytery. So in the English Presbytery, at that time, we had only ordained a lady who was widowed, and another lady who is single, and then me. And I was married and a mother. So when he asked me that question, by the grace of God and the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, I just said to him, I would really like to learn from you. How do you cope being a minister and a father? And then there was silence. And some of my colleagues who were supportive of women, they kind of smiled quietly, and the chairman said, okay, and now moving on to the next question. You know, what upset me about that question is assumption that it's only the mothers who are responsible for looking after the children. No wonder, you know, this gave rise to a lot of, still gives rise to a lot of problem in families. So, so this is something that I've always felt to be an important issue, and I'm going to talk now about what is Asian feminist biblical studies. When I first started in my PhD study, that was a question about, you know, that's almost 20 years ago. That was something that was kind of brewing in my mind. You know, so at that time, I learned about Western feminist biblical studies, and that would focus mainly on gender inequality. And then I read about womanist biblical studies. And on top of that, there's the problem of dealing with racial inequality. And I suppose that is what Dr. Gale A Yee would have been talking about, that besides race, there are many other aspects, so which she calls intersectionality. And then there's the Mujerista biblical studies from the women in Latin America. And on top of those problems would be the problem of economic inequality. And then I read about African feminist biblical studies, and they would highlight the problem of colonialism. And then what I see in all these approaches are there's a variety of methods used. So feminist biblical studies is not about method. And Dr. Gale A Yee also mentioned about all kinds of biblical studies, hermeneutics, and reading such as historical, literary, cross-cultural, socio-political, post-colonial, or combination of these methods. So on further reflection, looking back now at the bigger picture, what I realized was that all these different types of feminist biblical studies focus on different issues or emphasis out of our own social location. And I would like to call them lenses. We all use different lenses from where we are and the challenges that we faced. So I'm going to present 3 lenses in Asian feminist biblical studies. Okay. And this is based on the collection of 14 essays from different feminist biblical scholars from different regions in Asia. So I'm going to actually use their essays for examples. So the 3 lenses, I want to propose that these 3 aspects are important in Asian feminist biblical studies, that of the community. And for this, I want to use an essay from Korea. You can see I use different colors kind of to map them onto the colors of the map here. So Korea here in East Asia. Then I want to talk about cross-cultural contextual reading. And I'm going to use examples from India, Philippines, and Vietnam. And then I'm going to talk about the crisis of injustice that can come from issues like colonialism, nationalism, immigration, and more than that. And for this, I want to use examples from Indonesia and with Japan. Okay. So first of all, the lens of looking at reading the Bible through the lens of the community. And here I want to refer to a work from Professor Kyung-Sook Lee's reading of the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. Professor Lee is the very first woman Old Testament scholar in Korea. She's now retired and Professor Emerita. So what's interesting about Lee's reading of Isaiah 53, okay, and I'm sure you're familiar with that passage. Who is this? Scholars usually ask the question, who is a suffering servant? And we know from the historical context, that could be the prophet, that could be the remnant of Israel, and of course, ultimately fulfilled by Christ. But Lee's focus was not so much on the suffering servant, but on the we who beheld him. And she pointed out that this third group of people first condemned the suffering servant. And then they realized that he was innocent and suffering for them. So in the end, they confessed their sins because of him. In other words, the we group need to respond to the suffering of others to bring about justice for all. And so she pointed out that we are all interrelated. And this very much resonates with traditional Asian emphasis on family and community. You know, a practical example is to see the response to mask wearing during the pandemic, you know, and in the Asian nations, well, maybe more in East Asia, people are much more cooperative about this than you might find in the West. So it's this idea of community that keep us interrelated to one another. So Lee emphasizes that the we group need to stand with the victims of injustice. And she applies this to the issue of the Korean comfort women. The Korean comfort women are those who were sex slaves, made to be sex slaves during the Japanese occupation in 1943. And by the way, I'm sure there are Koreans, whether in America or here in Asia. And if you are there, I would like to know that you're there and leave a note in the chat. So Lee tells us that it was due to one woman who was the daughter of a Korean minister who raised this issue about the comfort women to the Korean church. And this eventually became a national movement to demand an apology from the Japanese government. So she says that if the we do not identify with the injustice, with those who were victims, if we do not respond, then we are just silent perpetrators of suffering as well. So I found this picture of the statue, famous statue of the comfort woman that was actually commissioned by the Koreans in Germany and was first put up in a town in Germany. And what fascinated me was that there is an empty chair next to this statue, this young girl who was forced to serve as a comfort woman at that time. I did not realize that there was an empty chair. And then the more I read about it, I realized that the empty chair is there to invite passerbys to sit down next to those who have suffered, to empathize with them, so that eventually they too can stand together with those who have suffered. Now, Lee shares that God, in Isaiah 53, God was also present with the suffering servant. So it struck me that that empty chair can also represent the presence of God with those who are suffering. And if you and I want to experience the presence of God, then we need to sit there too. Now, I want to emphasize that community is a common Asian value. And this is a book that I edited some years ago, which is a collection of essays by various Asian women theologians. And one of the common themes that came up was collaboration with men, women and men together for the common good of society. You know, in Asia, if you say that you are a feminist scholar, you're doing feminist studies, people kind of react. You know, it's kind of threatening because basically they think that it's women causing trouble, you know. I suppose they have flashes of bra burning or kitchen living, you know, and stuff like that. So one of the scholars here, a senior Indonesian scholar, Lebang, wants to emphasize not so much feminist studies, but she calls it a move from patriarchy to partnership, for the good of all. And this definitely sounds more positive to Asians. So for example, in my writing about 1 Timothy 2, about women not being able to teach, I want to talk about the equality of men and women in the ministry, but I want to talk about it as a partnership. I've written on Ephesians 5 about marriage, what does it mean for the man to be the head and all that. And I want to talk about egalitarian marriage, but I want to emphasize also that it is a partnership for the good of both. So that's the community aspect. Moving on to the second lens, and that is the cross-cultural reading of the text. And this is where I want to highlight from India, Monica Melanchthon's reading of Job's wife, from the Philippines, Lily Apura's reading of Genesis 1, and from Vietnam, Tran Thi Lee's reading of Songs. These are all people who are teaching, these ladies, these authors are Old Testament scholars who are teaching in their respective seminaries. So let me start with Melanchthon, and there's a picture of her. She's teaching actually in a seminary in Australia. And if you're from India, please drop a note in the chat. So we all know the problem with Job's wife as presented in this biblical text. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold on to your integrity? Curse God and die." And then some early writers have said that the wife was as bad as the devil. She was the devilish wife. And then Job scolds her, and in the end, Job says, it is said in the text, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now, I highlighted two words in red because I want to talk about them later. But this particular emphasis that Job did not sin with his lips, what does that mean? It seems to imply that something going on in his heart. And notice that the wife is talking about his integrity. So Melanchthon does a very interesting thing, which is to read the story of Job together with the story of an Indian wife in the famous epic Mahabharata. So in this story about Savitri, who was a princess, and I'll give you the story, I have to give you the story in a nutshell. There's this princess who married a prince who only had 1 year left to live. But she loved him, so she married him. And when the year was up and it was the day of his death, she accompanied him to go into the forest to meet the god of death, Yama. And you can see there's a representation of the god of death. But she kept following him, and the god of death was trying to get rid of her. So Yama said to her, "I'll give you 3 wishes on condition that after I grant you your 3 wishes you have to live. And none of those wishes can be about bringing your husband back to life." Okay, so she agreed. The first wish was, please give back my father-in-law his eyesight. The second wish was, please give my own father 100 sons because her father had no sons. And the third wish was, I want my husband and I to have 100 sons. So Yama, in his hurry to get rid of her, granted all her 3 wishes. And guess what? I hope you caught it, that he was tricked, because the third wish, he couldn't grant the third wish and then kill the husband at the same time. So Savitri and the husband continued to live to have 100 sons. And the point of this story is about Indian wives who should do everything they can for the good of their husbands. So how would an Indian woman read the story of Job's wife? And the Indian insight is that Job's wife would actually be trying to help Job rather than taunt him, okay, as represented by this painting by Georges de la Tour. And if we take that insight into the text, scholars now realize that Job's wife was really trying to help him. You see, Job did not sin with his lips. What was in his heart? He must have been really angry with God as well. So Job's wife is saying to him, you call yourself a man of integrity, then be honest with God and tell God how you really feel. And which is what he did in chapter 3. He started cursing, not God, but the day of his birth, which is the day of creation as well. And because it was when Job was able to start lamenting and pouring out all his sorrow and anger, that he met with God at the end of the book of Job. So in fact, people realized that this title for the painting of Job's wife was not accurate. If you look closely at the painting, she had this very kind face. She's holding a candle, which is supposed to represent hope. So now this painting has been renamed Job Visited by His Wife. Now, one can also ask the question, how does the book of Job inform the Indian culture? Okay. Melanchthon writes that Indian wives are expected to make sacrifices for their husbands, even to the extent, okay, from the past we know, even to the extent of widow burning. Now, if you read the book of Job in the epilogue, what is really interesting is that he had back his 7 sons and 3 daughters, but it's only the 3 daughters who were named, and they were explicitly given an inheritance, which was unheard of in those days and contexts. So in other words, daughters were just as good as sons, if not better, okay, because they were the only ones named. So that's the Indian cross-cultural contextual reading. Okay. Let me give you another example now from the Philippines. And I see that some people have wrote in the chat that they are from the Philippines. So if you are from the Philippines, whether in America or in Asia, again, drop a note in the chat. So this is by Lily Apura, who is a professor at Silliman University. And she addresses this particular text in Genesis chapter 1. Okay. Now, the common reading of God as a creator in the context of the ancient Near East, and they point out that only kings are described as being in the, I skipped the word image, I lost that word, as being in the image of God. Therefore, God is perceived as in the masculine role as creator king. Okay. And Old Testament scholars would understand this, especially from the artifact that is shown here in my slide of a new Sumerian king, because the phrase image of God is actually carved on his robe. But Apura wants to make the point that God is not just a masculine God. So what she does is to read the creation account in the light of the Filipino culture of the Babelans. Now, what are Babelans? These are your medicine women, which is shown in the title of this painting by Carlos Francisco, History of Philippine Medicine. So you can see this lady here. She's the Babelan. She's a shaman. And in pre-Spanish Philippines, Apura points out that women were considered as almost equal to men. The Babelans were the religious leaders, and she made this interesting point. It's interesting to me because of my legal background. She said that the husband had to secure the consent of his wife when entering into any contract. But when the Spanish conquerors came, she said that they demonized the Babelans and installed patriarchy. Apura, however, points out God's feminine role from this, background of the Babelans' role. She notes that God also had a feminine role in creation. First, she talked about God as a homemaker, because in Genesis 1, in days 1 to 3, God had to prepare the home for the occupants in days 4, 5, 6. For example, on the first day, God created light and darkness, which is the home for the sun, moon, and stars. And day 2, God separated the waters above from the waters below, and that became the home for sea creatures and birds, and so on. she pointed out that God is also a provider of food. You know, the ancient Asian mother is always asking this. Well, at least especially for the Chinese mother. The first thing my mother would say to me when she sees me is, have you eaten yet? Have you had your dinner? You know, and then she would ask me, have you fed your children? So, and she pointed out that this is what God does after he had created humankind. He said, I provide all this food in all creation, all the plants as food for human beings and for the animals. And in Genesis 2, God played the role of a matchmaker. So all these, this interpretation would then have implications for, that would be social, ecological, economic, and political implications. And how does the Bible inform the Filipino culture? Well, we could say that healing is not found in spirits, good spirit, bad spirits. Healing is found in the Holy Spirit, in God as in his role as father and mother, who created and cares for all his creatures. So that's from the Philippines. Let me go on and talk about Vietnam. Okay, and this is Tran Tili's reading of Song of Songs. So if anyone is from Vietnam, please drop a note as well. Unfortunately, I could not find a picture of Tran, but this is a book that she contributed to. She focuses on the first few verses of song to point out the sensual aspect of love. But she wants to emphasize in particular that it is the woman who is speaking and taking the initiative. And she compares this to the new poetry movement in Vietnam. This is a movement that rejects the old tradition and speak more freely of sensual love. So she quotes from this poet, Shin Tiêu, who had this line that she picks up, because it's also talk about kisses. I want to be waves to kiss you as yellow sands. But then Tran points out that the poet still reflects Vietnamese patriarchal tradition, since it is the man who initiates his expression of love. While in the song, the lovers are equal in their love relationship, with the woman being the first to express her desire for the kisses of her lover. Should be lover here. And Tran wants to encourage the Vietnamese church, which is a very, very conservative church, to address the issue of sexuality and marriage, because the marriage institution in Vietnam is under great stress today, with increasing divorces, dysfunctional families, delinquencies, and sadly, even suicides. So that's the second lens of cross-cultural reading. And the third and last lens is to consider the crisis of injustice. And let me begin with Indonesia. Ira Mangililo's reading of the Levite's concubine, and I realized that Ira is right here in this class right now. So anyone from Indonesia, please leave a note as well. A second example that I will use is from Japan, Hisako Kunokawa's reading of the Syrophoenician women in Mark 7. As you can see, I can only pick a few places out of Asia. So what I noticed about these two types of reading is Mangililo's approach is to start from the text and go to her historical context. And then for Kunokawa's, it is moving from her historical context to the text. Okay, so this is a picture here of Mangililo. Ira, I chose the best picture I could find on the internet, so I hope you like that. And she talks especially about the dismembering of the Levite concubine. And because, you know, there's a very short presentation, I hope that if you don't know the story, you would read Judges 19. So the concubine was cut up and sent to the 12 tribes of Israel to call them together to fight for justice. So using social political analysis, Mangililo says that the butchering of the concubine was for the purpose of bringing the 12 tribes together. However, a unity based on violence resulted in more violence in the end. And I know Dr. Gale A Yee has written a lot about this in the book of Judges. So violence against women in the name of nation building only led to the breakdown of the nation. Maggie Low then applies this to her historical context, which is the 1965-66 massacre under President Sukarno against the community. Sorry, it shouldn't be community. It should be the communist party, especially the Gawani, which is the Indonesian women's movement. And I was only a young child, but my parents who were living in Singapore would have been very well aware of the attack against the Chinese as well in Indonesia, because many of them then came over to Singapore. It is estimated anything from 1 to 3 million people were killed in Indonesia. The Gawani was not an explicitly communist party. They were just interested in promoting women's rights and welfare, but they did work with the Communist Party toward their goals. So after the massacre, the next president, President Suharto, started a new order, but he emphasized the domestication of women. And Maggie Low wants to make the point that in the light of what happened to the Levite's concubine, violence against women may build patriarchy, but it certainly doesn't do anything for nation building, not for the prosperity of the nation. Finally, I want to move on to Japan. Hisako Kinokawa's reading of the Syrophoenician woman. And there's this very strange remark by Jesus. Let the children be fed first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Now, Dr. Gale A Yee said that if you see anything racist, if you see anything sexist, you should ask questions. And that is what Kinokawa did. So as you can see in this painting, there's this woman and there's a dog next to her, like Jesus is treating her like a dog. Kinokawa reads the text out of her historical past. So she talked about Japanese expansionism and exclusivism. As you can see here, Japan expanded into Asia during World War II. And exclusivism refers to their belief that they were the superior race over all of Asia. So with that historical awareness, Kinokawa was able to pick up the elements of expansionism and exclusivism in the story of Mark as well. She notes that Jesus, it was emphasized by Mark that Jesus went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. So she did a little bit more study on this. Here's a region of Tyre and Sidon. But what she points out is that this is the region of Tyre is quite distinct from the city of Tyre, which was on an island just off the coast, because this was a flourishing trade center, whereas the rest of the mainland was very poor. And whatever they grew in the mainland was simply taken away to feed the rich. And this would have included the poor Galilean farmers as well. So this explains Jesus' analogy about food, saying that one should not take bread from the children, meaning the poor Galileans, and give them to the dogs, who were then the rich Tyrians. Kinokawa points out that this is Mark's subtle criticism of Roman expansionism, that just emphasize the disparity in the classes between the rich and the poor. So the Syrophoenician woman in the story agrees with Jesus. Yes, we shouldn't take food from the poor. And in fact, she is identifying with the poor because she is from this region. And all she is asking for are crumbs. So Jesus grants the request of the one who identifies as and with the marginalized. So Kinokawa then, here, back to Jesus again, and here's the woman who's identifying with the oppressed. So Kinokawa exhorts Japanese churches to side with the oppressed, specifically the Korean comfort women, just like what I talked about at the beginning. In other words, Jesus sits in the empty chair, and so should we. So that rounds up my presentation, 3 lenses in Asian feminist biblical studies. And that's all the time I have for, and I'll pass the time back now to Dr. Kwok Pui Lan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Low, for this wonderful presentation, which gives us a preview to what our Asian sisters are doing in terms of their interpretation of the Bible. I know that many participants appreciate the PowerPoint, especially with those images. Now, I want to invite Dr. Yee and Dr. Low to come back on the screen so we can begin the question and answer session. We have several questions posted in the Q&A. The first question has to do with the intersectionality of identities. This person writes, in the church, we usually hear that we have to prioritize our Christian identity or make that our primary identity and make our cultural or gender identity secondary. Many pastors and Christians say that our identity in Christ needs to be overarching and not just an intersected part of us. What are your thoughts? Can we begin with Dr. Yee, because you talk about intersectionality. The question is the Christian identity primary? All other identities secondary? Or no, they are intersectional?
Well, I think you answered my question. I mean, your Christian faith is one part and a very important part of your identity, but it's only just a part. It's only just a part. There are many other facets of your identity beyond your, the Christian faith does have an impact on your gender, your understanding of yourself as a woman, your understanding maybe of your class status or whatever. But it is, for your Christian faith is simply one part. Just like my Roman Catholicism was a very important part, but it wasn't my only part.
I think my response from where I am, maybe when you live in a more homogeneous society, maybe we don't have as much challenges as there might be when you're an Asian American, for example. So I would tend towards thinking that my Christian identity gives me the foundation, the foundation to who I am. What am I supposed to do in the world? My worth, my contribution. But that doesn't mean it should suppress all the other aspects of my identity as a woman, as a wife, as a mother. I think they both inform each other. They guide me as to what it means, for example, how to relate to the poor, the marginalized, to my own family. But that doesn't mean that I can't question the traditional way. Maybe my Confucian background, that you always have to be subservient to parents, subservient to husband. So my Christian identity would question that as well, and or that can inform my Christian identity, as in the importance of community, for example. So yeah, I probably give a slightly different answer to that.
Thank you. There is also a question. In some of the Asian and Asian American churches, the religious ethos is quite conservative, especially regarding the interpretation of the Bible. Now, this intersectional approach or the feminist approach to the Bible may be considered too radical, if not progressive. Are there ways we can introduce these new forms of interpretation in a way that we will not be ostracized in our churches?
Well, the tradition is to let the elder speak first. So, Dr. Yee,
the thing is that, I'm kind of hemming and hawing here because it depends on your context. All right, when you say conservative, I mean, is it completely closed-minded or not? I mean, you just have to figure, you have to read your context in the way to see the opening, all right? I mean, yes, some, there are churches, and again, we struck, I'm glad I'm not part of it, such a church, but even so, there are ways to when you go into Bible study, what are people saying? All right, what are the questions they ask? What are they seeing in the text, and go from there and relate it to the context. Again, what automatically comes to mind is Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. Okay, you start with the context. Yes, you might have a conservative, but there are certainly issues in your conservative context that people are questioning, are trying to push back on, or accepting. What are the issues in your conservative churches that you can help them with in their interpretation of the Bible? So again, I would say start with the context, and then assuming that they are open-minded, then work from there. Work from aha moments in your context. Always work with the aha moments. Having, like again, I have to go back and as a teacher, you have to go and start where the student is, all right? And kind of push a little, but there are times when they go, aha, and then you can work from there. Okay.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Gale A Yee here. And starting with first, I think it's our attitude. We go with the attitude to listen. What are your concerns? What are your fears? I'm not here to turn your world upside down. Let me talk about the women ordination issue, for example, which is still going in the Presbyterian Church here in Singapore and for me. So, I'm not trying to take over the church. I want to tell them I'm here to serve. And it takes time for all this. So in my previous church, I think what helped if they see the effectiveness of your ministry. I'm not there to argue with you. I want to help you strengthen your ministry, etc., etc. And then they don't feel so threatened, And then let's discuss the text. And this is really going to take time because they have built up a certain presumption. If I deal with 1 Timothy 2, for example, I like to start with Genesis 2. I'm here, the Old Testament scholar here, and I like to do, yes, your traditional historical method, because that's, in the Asian church and in Singapore, the Bible is very important, and the historical critical method is, a long respected method. So it's, okay, for example, the word, the wife as a helper. I like to unpack that from the Hebrew understanding, what is helper, Ezer, and this is thanks to a lot of feminist scholars who have actually studied this. This is not your domestic helper kind of helper. This is God as helper. And therefore a woman is not just secondary, but it's really a great strength provided by God. Other things that I like to open people's eyes to, for example, the word rib, zela, it's not just that bone in your body, it actually means more like half a side, So I drop these things for people to think about. But yes, there are very conservative people here, so I know it might take a lifetime I hope I see something by the end of my lifetime. Yes. So that's my response.
Thank you very much. There is also a question. Both of you talk about different ways of interpreting the Bible. If the Bible is so much related to the context. So for example, Dr. Low, you gave examples from many different parts of Asia. So different people will be reading the Bible in different ways. How can we evaluate what interpretation may be truer, or how do we adjudicate if we have so many contextual readings of the Bible?
Great question. Actually, I wanted to highlight that. So just give me the opportunity to do that now. I know that different contextual scholars may have different take on this. Do we read when we read the scripture and the context, which do we prioritize? Yes, I understand that. And here I agree with Council Lee, whom I talked about earlier. Some take them as equal. Some might take context as more important. But for people of faith, you know, if you believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God, then that would take the priority. Because you know, if we believe that the world is fallen because of sin, then all cultures are fallen, imperfect in some way. Okay, so here I'm the traditional Calvinist Presbyterian talking about the fallenness of human nature and therefore culture. So then we look at, ultimately the Bible would have the priority. And by the way, that's Professor Kwok Pui Lan just now mentioned about my essay in the Oxford Handbook of Isaiah. I just received this yesterday, the physical copy, which is why I'm happy to show it to you now. And this is what I discussed in my article on reading Isaiah in Asia. Which do we prioritize, issues of Confucianism or the scripture? But that is not to say that, you know, you use the Bible to just impose it on culture. Sometimes culture gives us insight into the scripture. Like for example, Job's wife, I think that was very helpful to see it from a different point of view, because the Bible can have been, it came to us through Western androcentric interpretation. So we need to take our blinkers off, and culture give us a different perspective. But at the same time, ultimately, you know, I would say that according to your faith, you have to give priority to the scripture.
See, this is where I would disagree with you. And I think I already mentioned that my Roman Catholicism, you know, was very influential for me. And for Roman Catholics, the Bible is not as authoritative for Roman Catholics. It doesn't mean it's not important, but it isn't as authoritative. And so I would not, you know, immediately go to the Bible, you know, to figure out, you know, what is truth and what is actually my faith. I mean, my faith, you know, is part of a whole sacramental system of, you know, Eucharist and sacraments, and, you know, it's larger than the Bible, okay? Now, how I prioritize things, all right, as a biblical scholar, because I mean, I think that's very important, but it's just that it's not an overwhelming part of my faith, okay? But for me, when I interpret the Bible, I asked a couple questions. Whom does my interpretation help? And whom does my interpretation hurt? Okay, so that's basically, you know, where I come down. Whom does my interpretation help? Whom does my interpretation hurt? Does it hurt, you know, Blacks, like, you know, slaves, be obedient to your masters, okay, which of course is a racist statement in the Bible, which I do not believe, all right? Taking that racism and applying it today, you know, that is something I would resist, okay? So whom does, or else, you know, again, you see a lot of conservative churches point to just a smattering of the biblical text, few verses to condemn homosexuality, okay? Again, whom does my interpretation of the text help? Whom does it hurt? Does it lead to, bashing of gays, and discrimination and excluding gays from worship? Or what can my interpretation help? So that's where, I come down in that matter of prioritizing. Whom does my interpretation help? Whom does it hurt? And so it's mine is a little bit broader than Dr. Low's.
Thank you very much. Because of time, we have one last question. We want to go back to Eve because we have two Old Testament scholars here. There is one question: what happens to Eve or women after the fall? Because Dr. Low, you also mentioned in Genesis 1, women and men are both created in the image of God. So what happens to Eve after the fall? I know that, Dr. Yee, maybe you can begin. You use an intersectional approach to talk about Genesis.
Well, we know what happened to Eve. She gave birth to Cain and Abel, all right? And she was married to a farmer. And again, if you study, do a lot of archaeology like I do, it was very hard to, by the sweat of the brow, is very literal. To do farming in Israel is awful. I've been on archaeological dig trying to, remove the stones. So she, as a Israelite woman, had a very, difficult life. But see, also again, with the work of Carol Myers, Carol has written that she did, even though she did not have, formal power in the household, she had informal power, and she did that a cross-cultural analysis of women in rural settings, having very informal power in the family. So, for the person of Eve, I don't know what happened to the person of Eve, but I know what happened to women after the fall in ancient Israel.
Thank you.
I think we have to look at the broader canon as well. I know perhaps the questioner is raising the question about the curse. Although Eve was not literally cursed, but the consequence was like, your desire shall be for your husband and he will rule over you, or he will overrule you. So there seems to be this power struggle going on in a marriage relationship. Well, if you're referring to that, then what we see after that in the rest of the canon is very redemptive. And scholars have pointed out there's the Song of Songs, for example, which restore this marital relationship, which is almost, it's like an equal level. The wife is the one who is speaking most of the time, and they're both enjoying each other. Then of course you look at the New Testament, then it goes back, even Paul in his exhortation to wives and husbands go back to what it was supposed to be in Genesis 2, because Christ bring about that redemption. So I hope that helps with answering the question.
Thank you very much for this wonderful webinar. And I am sure that our participants have learned a lot. Please join us next week when we are going to talk about social ethics and sexuality. We will have two scholars, Dr. Kunjun Christine Pei and Dr. Sharon Bong, joining us. Goodbye. Thank you.